So far, for a generation or two at the very end of the 11th century of the Common Era, the three vital forces of the West were united in a purpose: the culture of the Byzantines still clinging to existence within the walls of Constantinople, joined with the barbaric strength of the Western Franks and Germans, with Norman, Lombard, Bavarian, and Saxon and Provençal in a flame of religious zeal. Well, it's important to distinguish between religious and churchy, right? The March of the Crusaders made a common fellowship of Christian priests, peasants, and lords, and astute Byzantines. But that strange fellowship did not survive long after the capture of Jerusalem, the Black Stone of Mecca. The Turkish Khans, the leader of the clans, had been I'm not really sure what exactly they mean by the word pagan here, other than it's a slur for non-Christian. They've been worshiping, if anything, the power of the eternal blue sky, because their conquests drew them to the south and west. They fell under the influence of Islam. This latest of world faiths was now spreading far beyond the Arabian desert, its place of origin. Now, Islam is just one of many terms for the same religion, really. It never claimed that it was a Arabian desert faith, The horse nomads found much in Islam to satisfy them. Its rigid fatalism, which didn't exist in Islam actually, fitted with their understanding of the littleness of man's endeavor against the forces of nature. Its simplicity appealed to their downright minds. It had stuff that people could, I understand that. That seems like the case, rather than some confusing Trinitarian doctrine, right? Its war propaganda seemed most reasonable to these makers of war. Well, it pretty much condemned almost every war that ever was. Muhammad said that God curses four types of people, and one of them is the people who have wars of conquest. So, this doesn't make sense in that. So they prayed toward the Black Stone of Mecca, the same way the Jews prayed towards Jerusalem. They followed the blind mysticism of the sheikhs who extorted and prophesied, rather than the rigidity of the Quranic law. So see, the problem is, just like nowadays, you have gun zawiyahs. I don't know what the word for gun is. In the same way, you have gun churches that so conservative that they can't turn to the Quran and what the Prophet said themselves. They turn to what the sheikhs say. But this is overgeneralization, of course. They preferred not to reason why. It suited them entirely to become warriors for the faith. Mahmud, reading India, posed as a champion of the faith, but his incentive was plunder. And we also find that religious freedom increased, for the most part, in India and even under the Turks, although there were some problems under the Turks, particularly when they solidified their power. They remained, as they had been, a warrior caste, producing nothing. The high civilization of the Arab intellectuals afforded them only physical comfort. They clad themselves in the splendors of the caliphs of Baghdad, while they made war on each other as they had done in former times in the steppes. So see, just another reason why they hadn't fully accepted Islam, with, some exceptions, right? But the Turks developed a culture of meritocracy and giving the people who test the best the greater opportunity for education. At this time, they lacked a guiding intellect to direct them. Umar Khayyam, contemplating them, wrote, Sultan after Sultan abode his destined hour and went his way. Now, poems are different than history books, but that's something else. Magnificent condoit eri warlords, chivalrous cavaliers, they seemed incapable of accomplishing more than to struggle for thrones. They called themselves by resounding titles, the valiant lion, the glory of the faith. They took the daughters of caliphs in marriage. They rode, well, that's not the right plural, but you know what I mean. They rode through courtyards where silver lions roared with the wind when the wind blew. But they remained fond, the simple horsemen that the Chinese poet had admired long since, riding out with falcons on their wrists to new adventures. History is just now making clear the full impetus of this foray of the Turks into the outer world. The record of their acts is obscure and often fails us. We are fully aware of them only when they come into contact with Western Europe. The persistence of their power is amazing. The Golden Horde that dominated most of Russia under the Mongols was largely Turkish and was known to the Russians of that time as Kipchak Ordu, the court of the desert men. Timur-Lang, the Iron Limper, best known to us as Tamerlane, who attempted world conquest at the end of the 14th century, was a Turk of mid-Asia ruling over Turks. The Mamluks, who conquered China in 1644, were northern frontiersmen, the first cousins to the earlier Turks. In fact, only China during the Ming Dynasty and Persia under the Safavids were ruled by dynasties of native rather than Turkish origin after the Turco-Mongols. India fell under the dominion of these adventurers when a Turk of Chagatai descent named Babar made his way into India and became the first of the so-called Great Mongols. As late as 1680, by then people knew that the Turkish government was not an Islamic government, at least among the Muslim people. It was, they weren't even outwardly, As late as 1680, when the better-known Turks of Constantinople were preparing to move on Vienna, a glance at the surrounding world would have revealed the Tatar Khans in the Crimea Peninsula and in mid-Asia, the Mamluks still the ruling force in Egypt, the Mongols in India, Manchus in China, and even in North Africa, the Turkish days of Algiers and Tunis. Much of their story is lost, and much of it is being placed together coherently today for the first time. The fact remains, as René Grosset points out, that only the Romans only the Romans and the Turco-Mongols were capable of world mastery. What the Populi Romani did as an aggressive citizenry, the Turks managed to accomplish by the amazing exploits of individual families. Their women who had once been as free as the warriors, they were quite willing to confine to their beds and to the harems of Islam. Well, they had more rights under Islam than the tribal societies, as previously indicated in one way or another. And the crimes against women are still, despite some of these stereotypes, are much, much lower. I mean, they're as high as an 11th of like a Western country when it comes to some serious crimes, but while domestic violence is probably more common than an 11th in some areas, but still it's significantly less regardless. And state of well-being and stuff like that's increased too. But a Chinese of the Tang era said, "Look not at a woman's face, consider her actions. The beauty of women is recognized only by wise men." A Seljuk Turk said, "Do not keep a woman hanging about the house. If you do, you may not be sick, but you will live in trouble. Never let a woman amuse herself outside the house. If she goes out, she will lose her honesty." How many thousands of brave men have lost their peace of mind over women? How many thousands of high and well-known persons have been put living because of women under the sod? Well, males or females, you got to be wary of their potential impact on you, but everyone's responsible for their own decisions. It's not that, this Western thing where women are like the big tempters and, they shouldn't speak in church and various things that the Bible and stuff indicates. These restless Turks, rolling as conquerors from Delhi to Bulgar and from Aleppo to Yenking, were, however exalted, tribal chieftains. They would submit to no authority. They had no purpose to guide them until, at the end of the 12th century, Genghis Khan subdued them and gave them, in effect, a design for living. The propagandists of Islam had not as yet penetrated far into the steppes. Well, yes and no, but a lot of stuff comes gradually. If you're sharing ideas and you're not forcing them on people. But then it's more authentic and it doesn't get all mixed up where you don't know, was this thing worship as a god before Christianity, or was this thing, and Tibetan Buddhism where you don't know what was Bon and what was Buddhism and what was something else. Some of them reached the Bulgars isolated at the edge of northern forests by the river Volga, and the scientific-minded Muslimin were amazed by the phenomena of the distant aurora borealis in winter and the long white nights of summer. Elsewhere, Arab merchants and zealous Hajis reached the crossroads of mid-Asia where the Uyghurs ruled. They built masajid beside the Buddhist temples and ancient shrines of that refuge in the mountains, but the tolerant desert folk treated Islam as another new faith of mankind. They did not yield to it. Only to the south had Islam claimed the Turkish clans, still wandering in search of conquest, still living in the saddle and struggling with each other. The Khwarezm Shahs at the edge of the Caspian, the Turkomans of the white and black sheep, the Kazakhs are the wandering ones who gave their name later to the Cossacks of the European steppes. Part of this could be, say, they think there's some sort of material culture that didn't catch on, and that's, not really much of a sign whether someone actually accepts a faith, except maybe Judaism, but Judaism is mostly Russian, German sort of Jews rather than real Semitic tradition developed by Semites. And, also when it comes to certain sins, it's like, well, if a person drinks or maybe they even neglect their prayers or something, that doesn't make them totally out of the fold of Islam. So, in the great Russian plain above the Black Sea, shamans trundled in their wagons beside the preachers of Islam. Here the Turkish clans had forced each other farther into the west. The half-cultured Khazars were surrounded by the savage Chinooks, who were, in turn, forced on by the Kankalis, the high carts, and then by the Kipchaks, desert men. With these last, the Russian princes waged ceaseless warfare. Barbarians struggling with barbarians. frontiersmen struggling with frontiersmen for the Black Earth prairies. Now, of course, I don't say that because somebody's speaking one language or another, or somebody is from a different lineage or a different country or a different faith or not. This has anything to do with the, barbarian is not really the term to use. I'm trying to replace that with frontiersmen, as they were called earlier. By the middle of the 12th century, the Common Era, the conflict of isolated groups had sprung in devastating fashion over the larger part of the known earth. The horse nomads, little changed by outer civilization, had become warlords. If they were powerful enough, the smaller groups were no more than bandits. And this twilight belt of savage struggle extended even over China. Now, one of the things that we find in the Bible, the book of Judges, warlords is actually probably a more accurate translation. Cathay. Now the Great Wall served as little more than a landmark. A wave of horsemen had passed over it, coming this time from the forest of Manchuria. They had appropriated the north of China and settled down to live in luxury within its grain fields. They were the Khitans or the Cathayans, and their conquest became Ta Cathay, or Great Cathay. They numbered not a fraction of the Chinese proper, then ruled by the Sung dynasty. The Sung were in their elder age of decadence, unable to maintain canals and roads or to guard the great mass of their workers from drought and famine in the Yellow Earth region. Still less were they able to drive out the Cathayans. They made the mistake of calling in other horse nomads from the northern breeding ground. These were Tungusic, or pig people, hunters who fished through holes in ice not long since. They were ancestors of the later Mancus, and they wore their hair long and tied tightly at the back. The first pigtails to appear within the wall, and they were accustomed to burn the carcass of a dog at the burial of a man, so that the dog could show the spirit of the man the way through the sky. Summoned out of their solitudes, they conquered the Cathayans, who became city dwellers and had grown wealthy with the labor of slaves. A remnant of Cathayans fled headlong into mid-Asia and set up an empire along the mountains. Kara, Cathay, Black Cathay, they found themselves neighbors of the Xians, other refugees, no more than a collection of bandit clans on the slopes of the Tibetan Plateau.